The United States has been firing a lot of missile defense interceptors lately. Are we running out? And what are we going to do to produce more of them? Recent conflicts, especially the June 2025 hostilities between Iran and Israel, have severely affected interceptor stockpiles, raising concerns about future readiness. Defending Israel from massive Iranian salvos with a total of as many 550 missiles fired was no small undertaking. Here's a look at just one of those barrages.
Trey, I mean, it's unbelievable to see what we're seeing going on in the skies above Tel Aviv right now.
In addition, after the strike on Fordo, Iran retaliated against a U.S. base in Qatar, requiring a lot of Patriots to be fired. Numerous interceptors have been shot over the last few years in Red Sea operations and elsewhere. I'm Tom Karako, Director of the Missile Defense Project here at CSIS, and with me today is my MDP colleague Wes Rumbaugh, who has a new paper out entitled The Depleting Missile Defense Interceptor Inventory. He argues that just as missiles have become weapons of choice, air and missile defenses have become table stakes for modern conflict. So, what's the status of the U.S. interceptor inventory after these recent engagements? And how should the U.S. government ante up to deal with this challenge? Today we're going to talk about the report's findings and what they mean for the future. We'll take audience questions, so please submit those online via the event page, and I'll get them here on my tablet. So, Wes, great report. You've got some findings in here that I think ought to be fairly bracing. So what's it about, and what should we know about this?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So, you know, it's kind of a recurring topic of conversation, especially in the air and missile defense world recently. It seems like every time the U.S. uses or transfers a missile anywhere in the world, we start talking about inventory concerns. So we're, you know, trying to bring a little bit of data, a little bit of hard data to some of those conversations and looking a little bit deeper into some of the budget documents to get at, you know, exactly what some of these inventory numbers are, while also recognizing some of the limitations of the data. But, you know, we've written on this topic before. I think it was last year in light of the October uses in the U.S. defense with some of the SM-3 missiles. We wrote a piece, or I wrote a piece on the topic of SM-3 inventories, and so I think we wrote this piece because the numbers were so big. You know, we got words and reports out of the exchanges this June, and we're talking about more than 150 THAAD interceptors, 80 SM-3 interceptors. You know, you compare that to some of the previous engagements where it was 12 interceptors or something like that. It was starting to get concerning, and so we wanted to get together the data to just put some of those usage numbers in context of what have we been buying, how many are still in the inventory, what's going on here.
You know, it used to be that they said you couldn't hit a bullet with a bullet. Now we're doing it so frequently, we're afraid we don't have enough of them, and the complaint is that we don't do it cheaply enough. So let me stay with kind of the big geopolitical thing. You know, you talk about missiles as weapons of choice, and these as the table stakes of modern conflict. Play with that metaphor, that poker metaphor a little bit, kind of about the significance of what's going on here in terms of policy decisions, in terms of kind of the geopolitical context, whether it's sending PAC-3s to Ukraine or refraining from sending them, as we've heard news reports, whether it's you know, parking a couple THAAD batteries in Israel and committing to that kind of an engagement. So give us a big picture there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a recognition that that's a big decision. And I think that, you know, it's a decision that the U.S. has made a lot. It's not the first time that the U.S., when there was an international crisis, deployed missile defense assets. We're talking about, you know, you go back to the first Trump administration, the number of Aegis destroyers doing figure eights off of the coast of the Korean Peninsula. And so it's kind of become the price that you pay to get access to a theater. You talk about the Ukraine conflict, for example, and the tactical exchanges there, the way that to be able to be survivable on the modern battlefield, you have to have some sort of air and missile defense to get there. It's sort of an extension of, I know that I remember that someone said that we can't use the phrase anti-access area denial anymore, but I do think that that was really an excellent phrase for, it's about creating windows of opportunity, creating access. And so the currency of that is the air and missile defense interceptors that allow you the opportunity. And so that's the ante. You know, to get cards in a game of poker, you got to put in a bet, you got to put in your ante. And so the metaphor here was to just sort of suggest that air and missile defense interceptors are akin to that. Now, I've read a little bit about poker strategy. You would not play international relations the same way that you would play optimal poker strategy, but I think that the metaphor at least applies to getting to the theater and being involved in the game.
Yeah. I think it was a former CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, who came over to CSIS and did their mightiest to get rid of the A2AD acronym, but acronyms have a way of sticking around in DoD. But we're going to get to the data here in a second. We're going to get to that, but let me stay with kind of the big picture here, which is you emphasized that this was a big decision, a strategic decision. These are scarce strategic resources, these interceptors, and we're going to see just how far we cut into our inventory. But there's all kinds of calculations about risk that you can take. Shot doctrine, shooting multiple interceptors at a single target. It's kind of the know when to hold them, know when to fold them thing. So, can you talk a little bit about the risk and the kind of the significance of what you're describing there?
Yeah, I'll disagree a little bit with Kenny Rogers. I think that you do have to count your money while you're sitting at the table, because to come up with your strategy, you have to know how many interceptors or how many chips behind that you have to make an optimal decision about how to deploy them. And so you have to understand kind of your baseline, and some of those numbers, especially for these interceptor inventories, are classified to some degree. So we're dealing with public and open source data and trying to give ourselves a reasonable calculation of what that data looks like to inform and consider the question of whether we should hold them or whether we should fold them in certain circumstances. And we have to make decisions internationally about, what is the importance of this crisis? What is the importance of the U.S. role? And how the U.S. can be a positive in influencing that. And that should have a significant weight on whether or not to deploy some of these air and missile defense assets. When you deploy these assets, you kind of have to, I think for a long time we were able to deploy these assets without using any of the interceptors, and in this circumstance we had to use them. And
right.
So that's, I think, what kind of was distinct in this circumstance. We were able to use them for deterrence, and then now we actually had to use the interceptors that we deployed for a deterrence purpose.
But there's always a cost. I mean, the Patriot battalions that came to LUD, they came from South Korea and Japan, which when you're trying to put all the emphasis on Indo-PACOM, that's kind of significant.
Yeah, I think that it has a cost independent of where they came from in terms of maintenance, deployment, op tempo with the Patriot Force
ability
has been a significant ability to modernize. All of these things, there is a cost, and some of these costs are hidden. And then obviously the cost of when you start seeing interceptors fly up into the air, it becomes a little bit more concrete for people right. When that happens.
So let's start digging into the numbers, and you've got some great graphs in here. I think the first one, which we'll pull up here, is focusing on procurement rate data. So tell us what's going on in this graph and what it tells us.
Yeah. So we often start with procurement rate data, and this is always a good starting point for discussing. But I don't think that, especially if the conversation is about interceptor inventories, this isn't the exact data that we're looking for, because it describes the demand from the government. But there is a gap between the money getting down and the procurement of these interceptors, and then the delivery of these interceptors, or those getting into the inventory. And we'll take a look at a couple of charts later that kind of elucidate some of that gap. But it's the easiest data to work with. And so here we have some data on Patriot PAC-3 MSE. So that's the Army interceptor that the U.S. Army is still buying. The Standard Missile 6 Navy interceptor, and both of those are sort of multi-mission interceptors. So they have ballistic missile defense capability as well as cruise missile defense, air defense, et cetera, types of capability. And so you can see that those are generally bought at higher rates than the other two interceptors that are on the chart, the Standard Missile 3 and the THAAD interceptor, which are both BMD specific. And so those are a little bit more expensive, and that gives you a little bit of extra capability in terms of the possibility of exo-atmospheric intercept and a number of other things. And so that makes those interceptors a little bit more scarce. You can't buy as many of the more expensive interceptors. And so that's a little bit of what we're seeing on the chart. Another thing that I think that I want to highlight, though, is the way that supplemental funding has played a big role in interceptor procurements recently. So the administration has made a big deal about interceptor procurement and munitions procurement in general being a significant priority. And so if you see all the way on the right part of the chart, you're seeing certain amount of shaded areas. Those are plus-ups from the One Big Beautiful or the reconciliation bill and supplementals going on there. I think I would also highlight in FY 2023 the PAC-3 MSE buy and a significant amount of supplemental funding from Ukraine transfers to supplement and increase the amount of PAC-3 MSE buys. Were very big for those inventories going forward.
So we bought them, but that doesn't necessarily add to the inventory the same amount, because we passed a lot of other MSCs off.
They passed older versions, because that's another thing that, becomes a problem when you're doing some of these calculations for the inventory is where's your baseline? Where's your starting? And so with some of those older interceptors in particular, it might be interceptors that are passed or were bought before the data started to get digitized. And then things like life extensions or things that keep missiles around longer than maybe their original service life. There can be a lot of inconsistencies there, and so getting at a very precise inventory number, very challenging in the public data.
I think that's a couple key points there. Is one, the number bought over time is a hint, but is not identical with how many we have in the inventory right now. And you highlighted a couple factors there, aging out. There's also testing, and yes, those are transferred to our friends or actually used in combat. So that's why we know more or less how many have been delivered, but it's not a perfect.
It gives you a rough order of magnitude, so that when you're looking at usage numbers, you can kind of have a mental picture of how much is that compared to what a standard. And that's why it's important to look at multiple years too, because any given year's procurement has a lot of reasons going on behind that, whether it's resourcing trade-offs within a department, whether it's trade-offs of priority or various other things. But then it's also, maybe they got to an inventory number that they were comfortable with, and so they were able to free up money to use on, there's a lot of other priorities. The Department of Defense can't build the whole thing out of air and missile defense. It's a means to an end. And so, there's a lot of stuff going on behind any one of those given procurement numbers. So you have to look at the holistic picture.
Yeah. The point about aging out, I think, is especially important. Sometimes folks will just look at, we have to steward our munitions. We couldn't possibly give any to Ukraine. But when things are going to be thrown away or things are going to be demilled, it would be in a way a shame if they weren't used, as opposed to paying for them to be
and it's a free opportunity to modernize. You get to buy the newest kit. You get to throw out the oldest kit and buy the newest kit as a replacement. And so it's kind of an opportunity in some ways as well.
That's how Slovakia got rid of their old Soviet national air defense. And guess what? Now they're talking about PAC-3. So another thing that you mentioned there is the change from year to year. And so let's pull up that number and take a look at the kind of the spikes and the sine wave of what's going on there.
Yeah, and so we looked at that just like year-to-year procurement quantity data and just kind of took a year-over-year percentage change. And so you're seeing in this chart a lot of variance, especially amongst the THAAD, the PAC-3 MS3 or PAC-3 MSE, and the SM6 procurements. And so what that does is, another way to say variance is inconsistent demand. And that creates challenges for the industrial base. Because when you have inconsistent demand, it creates frustrations when you can't ramp it up as fast as you want to. But to make the investments in the sort of surge capacity and resilience that the administration has talked about wanting in the munitions industrial base, what they need is a consistent enough demand signal to know that they're going to use that regularly to produce those deliveries, because they need the certainty to be able to invest in capital infrastructure. We're talking about big manufacturing plants. We're talking about hiring that sort of workforce. And so all of those challenges require a little bit more certainty. And so it's almost the outlier on this chart that's interesting here. It's the Standard Missile 6, which had a multi-year procurement. And so you see that it has the flattest line at 0 year, because it had a set of multi-year procurements where They bought the same number of interceptors over a given period of time, and it stayed flat, and it created a little bit of certainty for that industrial base to make that a little bit easier. But we've talked about the demand for those assets globally. I think that there's a sort of a mismatch there. There's been a very clear demand signal from the political and military leadership that it wants to use these assets. But when it comes to the demand signal for the purchasing of the capabilities into industry for the industrial base, it's been a little bit more of a mixed signal that they're getting. And sometimes that's been positive on the supplemental side, but is that mixed signal good enough to make an investment in some of the capabilities that we're looking for?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, the flatness of the SM6 thing is a good thing because it speaks to discipline in terms of year-over-year buys. It also speaks to, we'll get to this in a minute, they hadn't been used until just recently, but it also speaks to the fact that the U.S. Navy has just wanted every SM6 they could possibly get coming off the line. I think SM6 was cleared for some FMS sales 10 years ago, and our allies our Aegis operating allies who would desperately love to have some of those. Most of them are still waiting. But there's two other things going on here.
Speak of the devil, so would the U.S. Army.
Yes, indeed. But also, what's going on with these spikes in FY18 and 22? What happened there?
So that was the previous Trump administration, another supplemental appropriation. That was I think it was the Missile Defense and Defeat Enhancements one that included significant plus-ups for both THAAD, SM-3, and also Patriot PAC-3 MSC. And so that led to sort of a significant buildup of both of those sets, especially the MDA interceptor inventories. You had back-to-back years on the THAAD side of over 100 interceptors being bought. And so we'll look at some of the charts and how that affected the inventory going forward.
Well, let's do that.
Yeah.
Here's the Standard Missile 3 specifically. You see a fairly disciplined purchase rate over time. Again, this is not just the 2A, it's also the 1A, 1B. But what's going on in the upper right-hand corner?
Yeah, so this is, it's important to point out, so this is the monthly delivery charts. So instead of taking the yearly procurement data, we've broken it down. And so each of these little hash marks is a monthly set of deliveries. And so the slope kind of gives you a sense, the steeper the slope, the more deliveries that are going on. And when then you have flat slopes or plateaus, that's where you've got delivery gaps. On this chart, we had a couple of, we had a little bit more precise data or estimates about SM-3 interceptor usage. So up in the top right corner, you can see the October 2024, 12 interceptors used. And I actually wrote about this. We looked about around this time last year, we looked at some of the SM-3 interceptor, and that's a little bit smaller of a chunk into that. So it was we could be a little bit more sanguine about that usage. You see the June 2025 80 interceptors, that's a little bit bigger of a chunk.
That's a big chunk. Yeah.
That's a little bit bigger of a chunk, but there's a little bit of deliveries going on sort of already scheduled for the end of 2025. So they're working their way back up to that inventory number, and that's something that has looked pretty strong. The question there is just kind of going forward. We talked about in that piece the decision about, you talked about some of the variants. It's the decision to stop buying the cheaper SM-31B variant and go exclusively to the larger 2A variant. There might be some considerations about capacity and capability going forward that the administration will need to take a look at.
Yeah, that was like 2 years ago. It was a little surprising that the Trump administration's 26 PB didn't explicitly reverse the termination of the 1B. I think I said 2 years ago that was perhaps the single most asinine decision in the, I think it was 25 budget request, and I would not be surprised if it gets reversed here in the coming
I think the Hill
days.
reversed it last year, and it wouldn't be surprising to see something similar.
Well, let's turn to THAAD then, because again, a lot of those have been used here. Let's pull up the THAAD delivery chart here as well. What does this tell us?
Yeah, so we wanted to look at THAAD because the numbers were just so much larger when we were looking at the reporting about the reported use rates. So we're again kind of looking at the delivery data, and you can see pretty healthy and consistent deliveries there coming from off the backs of some of the supplementals. So we're talking about, again, that gap between the procurement and delivery. And so you see the kind of escalation in the 2021, 2022, 2023 timeframe of a steeper slope there, and that's coming off of the back of that FY 2018 supplemental and FY 2019 procurement buys of back-to-back years of over 100 interceptors.
I want to get to the plateau in a minute here, but could we stay with this for a second in terms of the usage that you were talking about?
Yeah, so we can kind of talk about, so that gets us to a number, or a total estimate of 534 interceptors delivered. And so that's, again, a point estimate. But the thing that was striking to me about the reporting on THAAD usage was the phrase more than. So
more than 150.
More than 150. And so we had a little bit more of a degree of uncertainty about how many THAAD interceptors were used there. And so we have to kind of do a little bit of estimating to think about, there's a range of possible impacts on the inventory. So we found an estimate of a number that we were reasonably comfortable with in terms of the deliveries, and then ran a parametric analysis of, okay, so we looked at a lot of different sources to find. We found one source that said maybe it was close to 100 interceptors used. Then the Wall Street Journal had 150. So that kind of gave us a set of a set of gapping, but then the phrase more than leaves a lot of room for interpretation there. And so we decided we would just kind of look at, what are 4 conditions here about, and then what's the impact on that inventory? And so it's, it can go from somewhere, even in the most optimistic case, we're talking about nearly 20%, but you start getting up to about 250 interceptors. That's almost half of the delivered inventory as we understand it.
That's a big deal.
That's a big number.
If it's 200, it's almost 40%. If it's closer to 250, it's 47%. That's a lot. What does that mean operationally? What does that mean modernization-wise?
Yeah. I mean, another way to maybe think about it is, and we're talking roughly here, it's pretty close. You do the calculations of how many THAAD rounds are in a THAAD launcher, how many launchers are in a battery, et cetera. It gets you to roughly 50 interceptors per battery is like kind of a, we don't need to bore anyone with the precise numbers or anything there, but it's the roughly 50 interceptors is per battery. And so every time you increase the number by 50, that's a battery worth of interceptors. And the U.S. has fielded 8 THAAD batteries. There's an Army requirement for a 9th, a long-running Army requirement for a 9th THAAD
2012,
battery.
if memory serves.
It's a very long, but so every 50 interceptors is functionally an additional battery worth of interceptors.
That's a lot. Let's turn now to what you talked about is that plateau. Why is it that there was this gap in deliveries to the United States in these intervening 4 years?
Yeah, so this is, again, the one thing that I've learned from looking at some of these monthly delivery data tables from the DoD comptroller thing, and when you look at them over the course of a number of years, is they are very subject to change. And so until the numbers are finalized, until the interceptors are delivered, there's definitely room for that to change. But one thing that we noticed when we were looking through some of this data is that there is a projected gap between July 2023 and April 2027 of deliveries for THAAD interceptors for the United States. And so the question is, because the production line isn't cold, the industry is making announcements about delivering additional THAAD interceptors. And so our assumption is that they're working on something like an FMS case. There was a big Saudi FMS sale a long time, or during the first Trump administration. And so they have to balance the industrial capacity for delivering those international sales and delivering U.S. sales. And so that's another concern and a consideration that has to be balanced when we're thinking about going forward, filling these interceptor inventory gaps.
It's the FMS stuff, and just keep in mind it was just a handful of years ago that the Emiratis used THAAD operationally against Iranian missiles fired in anger, and the Saudis are at least in the process of buying more THAADs than the U.S. Army has, which is pretty interesting. But that kind of brings us to whether those numbers, whether those goals and targets are going to change. And there's been some reporting, good reporting in the Journal and other places about, especially DepSec Feinberg, pounding the table and saying, no, we need to ramp up missile production. We need to ramp up a dozen or more prioritized munitions. So let's kind of shift to that. And I think actually we've got a question on this front that's just come in from a grad student. What incentive structures, be it long-term contracts, minimum quantities, advanced funding, what incentive structures could be useful to encourage industry to invest in expanded production capacity? That's kind of the big $64,000 question these days.
Yeah, the online question's definitely not making it easy. I think that there's a couple of takeaways about the what's next for this administration. The first thing I'd highlight is lots of discussion about acquisition reform, lots of discussion about the requirements process in general. And so I think one area of particular attention is how do we do the requirements? How do we calculate the inventory level requirements or the total munitions requirements for DoD, and how do we think about those? I think that that's an area ripe for reexamination in light of we have a lot more operational recent data about expenditure rates in modern conflict, how many missiles we're going to need to fire, what the rate of those things is going to be. And so it allows us to maybe dig into some of those requirements and think through, what are the additional numbers, or what are the additional swing capacity that you need outside of maybe your you can come up with a reasonable number for your pacing threat. But if the U.S. is going to use missile defense interceptors as sort of a deployable deterrence capability, like we talked about in a number of different theaters, do you have enough interceptors to support that sort of role for missile defense as a deployable capability, and thinking through what the requirements for that are? And I think that allows you to kind of filter that through some of the budgetary decisions for the rest of the Department of Defense, and it allows you to prioritize some of those things.
Well, I think just sort of the bottom line here, I think, is that there's been a change of sense of the likelihood of use. The threshold for use has gone down. We used to think our GBIs, they're kind of a strategic thing. If somebody shoots an ICBM at the U.S., that's a strategic event. But we're seeing the use of these, I don't want to call them attritable assets, but they're kind of being treated as attritable assets. And that, I think, is informing the need to massively modify or update the total objective goals. And so I think in this spring in the budget, the MSE number was quadrupled?
It was, the Army, I think it was their their threshold acquisition number, the acquisition number that they're aiming for MSEs went up substantially. And because the other thing that signals to industry is sustained demand. It says we're going to be in this MSE business for a long time until we hit this number. And so that's a very valuable piece of information that DoD can send to industry to get them to invest in some of those long-term capabilities. The other big challenge, though, is DoD gets a lot of flack for being a bad customer, and some of that is well-earned. But DoD has one of the strangest and most high-profile finance and accounting departments in the world, and it's the same finance and accounting department that the entire U.S. government has. It's the United States Congress, and so they have to deal with all of the occasional insanity of the United States Congress in terms of we're still operating under a years-long CR, and there's a prospect of doing it again next year. And we've papered over it with supplemental appropriations for Israel transfers, for Ukraine transfers. In the reconciliation bill, there's talk about doing that again. But is that a stable enough mechanism to convince industry to invest long term?
Well, enter Steve Feinberg. Enter the expenditure rates of this summer. The significance of the Ukraine expenditure stuff has really begun to sink in. And what you're seeing in the public reporting is the journals talked about the desire for 2,000 MSEs a year. A couple weeks ago, the head of Boeing Defense said in a public forum that they were planning to ramp up to 2,250 PAC-3 seekers per year. Now that's a lot more than they're doing right now, seeing as how we've been doing 550 or moving up to 650 MSEs a year. That's a big lift. And so I think what you're pointing to is that's a lot of risk that publicly traded companies are being asked to take in the absence of no kidding real assurances that this demand signal is real and that it will be sustained. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge that DoD faces, is sending a credible long-term, and to some degree that's a function of the annual appropriations process. It's just sort of a challenge that DoD faces. But yeah, they need to figure out some way to, and so that's, I think, why some of the requirements changes in particular sort of suggest we're in this business for the long haul, and that's a way to kind of, they've talked about wanting to ramp up production. You got to build the ramp and build a stable ramp for industry to, want to walk up that thing. I've walked up some unstable ramps over the years, and that's a little bit more harrowing, and you're not going to want to make that investment as cleanly. And so I think that what can DoD do to make walking up that ramp a little bit easier for some of them in industry? So looking at some of those things, and then, how can it make that like credible long-term demand signal? How can it make that credible commitment is, I think, a question. And that's something that we're continuing to work on research on. And so that's something that I think we look forward to sharing. We're in the process of doing some research on what are the most effective ways to build that ramp. Is something that people should look forward to from us.
Something maybe more steep than a wheelchair ramp, and something more doable than climbing a fireman's pole. Well, hey, thanks, Wes. Congrats on the paper again. And like you say, we do have other things in the pipeline on this exact topic. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks to both the CSIS Missile Defense and streaming and broadcasting teams for making this event possible. As Wes was saying, we've got a number of papers and events in the pipeline coming up in 2026, so keep an eye out for those and for other discussions from the CSIS Missile Defense Project. And in the meantime, happy holidays.